politicians are so flawed. If there's anyone that's vulnerable to AI, it's politicians. Because if politicians are coming up with these ineffective strategies for handling all these social issues, but then you throw these social issues into an advanced form of ChatGPT, and it says, over the course of 10 years, this is the best case scenario for this strategy. Right. And this is how to follow this, and this is how it all play out. And something like that actually could be very valuable if it wasn't directed by people with ulterior motives.
So I call that, my metaphor for this is the Ring of Power, right, from Lord of the Rings. Right? The whole point of the Ring of Power was, like, once you have the Ring of Power, it corrupts you. You can't help but use it, right? And this is, I think, what we've seen in social media over the last decade, right? Which is when people get into, activists or politicians get, this is the Twitter files, right? People get in a position to be able to influence the shape of the public narrative. They will use that power, and they will use it in actually even very ham-fisted ways, right? Like a lot of the stuff that's in the Twitter files is stuff that's just like really dumb, right? And it's just like, well, why would they do that? And it's just like, well, because they could, right? Because they had the Ring of Power.
Like what's an example of something?
So what was it? There was this thing, I forget what it was, but there was some reporting that went through the FBI that there were all these Russian, basically fake accounts on Twitter, and it turned out one of them was the actor Daniel Baldwin.
What is Daniel Baldwin, like a hardcore right winger or something?
He must have been saying, it's one of these things where he said something that pissed somebody off, right? You got to put it, it's the old thing. You got to put it on a list, right? The list gets fed through one of these bureaucracies. It comes out the other end that everybody's a Russian, asset. They get put on the block list. It's like, okay, did he have, did you have First Amendment rights? Do you have First Amendment rights on social media? Can the government be involved in this? Can the government fund groups that do this? Right? Is that legal? Is that allowed? Because there's a lot of government money flowing to third-party groups that do. Oh, this is the other thing. If the government cannot legally do something itself, it's somewhat ambiguous as to whether they can pay a company to do it for them. Right? And so you have these various basically pressure groups, activist groups, university quote-unquote research groups, and then basically they receive government funding, and then they do various levels of censorship or other kinds of unconstitutional actions. Because in theory, right, they're not government. Right? The First Amendment binds the government. It doesn't bind somebody who's not part of the government. But if they're receiving government funding, does that effectively make them part of the government? Does that make it illegal to provide that government funding? By the way, these are felonies. It is a felony for somebody to with government resources to with either employee of the government or under what they call, I think it's color of law, sort of within the scope of the government, to deprive an American citizen of First Amendment rights.
And is it considered depriving someone of First Amendment rights by limiting their use of social media? Has that been established?
Good. So, I mean, it has not been, to my knowledge, a Supreme Court case yet. There have been some early fights on this.
But you feel like that?
I think ultimately goes to the Supreme Court. My guess would be ultimately what happens is the Supreme Court says the government cannot itself cause somebody to be banned on social media. That's unconstitutional for First Amendment grounds. But then also, I believe what they would say if they got the case would be that the government also cannot fund a third party to do that same thing. That's my speculation. That's my guess.
How were the third parties censoring people? How were they doing it?
Oh, they were passing lists, right? So they had direct channels with the social media companies, and so they passed, and they have these working groups, and there's a lot of this is in like email threads that have now come out in the Twitter files, for Twitter, and so they basically pass in these lists of like, you need to take all these tweets down, you need to take down all these accounts. Wow. And then, there's lots of threats and lots of public pressure and bullying that, kind of takes place. And then, the politicians are constantly complaining about, hate speech and misinformation, whatever, putting additional kind of fuel on the fire on these companies. And so anyway, having lived through that for a decade, as I have across multiple companies, I think there's no question that's the big fight for that's the big fight for AI. And it's the exact same fight. By the way, it's a lot of the same people are now pivoting from their work in social media censorship to work on AI censorship. So it's a lot of these same groups, right? And it's a lot of these same activists and same government officials that have been focused.
Now, are they involved in all of there's many competing AI models. Are they involved in all these competing AI models or trying to become involved? Is there one that's more ethical or more likely to avoid this sort of intervention?
So the state of the art right now is basically you've got Google that's got their own model. You've got basically OpenAI, which is a new company but already quite large, and then it has a partnership with Microsoft, and so Bing is based on it. So that's two. And then you've got a bunch of kind of contenders for that, and these are companies with names like Anthropic and Inflection that are newer companies but trying to compete with this. And so those are, you might call those like right now the big four, at least in the U.S. And look, the folks at all of these companies are like in the thick of this fight right now. The pressure somewhat corresponds to which of these is most widely used, but so it's not equal pressure applied to all of them, but they're kind of all in that fight right now. And by the way, it's not like they're like necessarily opposed to what I'm saying. Is they may in fact just want to cooperate with this, either because they agree with the desire for censorship or they just want to stay out of trouble. So there's that whole side of things. That's the company side of things. And then there's an open source movement, right? And so then there's all these people basically building open source AIs. And those are coming out really fast now. There's like a new one every week that's coming out. And this is just code that you can download off the internet that does sort of a smaller version of what these bigger AIs do. And there's open source developers that are trying to develop basically free versions of this. And some of those developers are very determined to have AI actually be free and uncensored and fully available to everybody. And then there's a big fight happening in Washington, D.C. right now where the companies working on AI are trying to get what the economists call regulatory capture. So they're trying to basically get the government to erect barriers so that new startups can't compete with them. And also they're trying to get open source banned. So there's a big push underway to try to ban open source as being too dangerous.
Too dangerous.
Too dangerous. Well, the case they make is if you believe AI itself is inherently dangerous, then the only safe way to have it is to have it owned and controlled by a big company that's sort of fused with the government, where in theory everything is being done responsibly. And if you just have basically free AI that anybody can download off the internet and use whatever they want, they could do all these dangerous things with it, right? And it needs to be stopped.
You think this is a bullshit argument?
Yes. Well, yes. Yeah. I think this is a very bad, evil. Yes, this is a very. I think this is a turning point in human civilization. I think this is on par with the development of the book, right, or the microchip or the internet, right? And there were authoritarians in each of those eras that would have loved to have had total monopolistic or cartel-like or government control over those new technologies. And they could have had a lot of control over the path of civilization, after that point. The Ring of Power, right? They could have had the Ring of Power.
So what can be done to prevent them from stopping open source?
So I mean, it's sort of so it starts with our elected officials. So it's who do we elect? Who do we reelect? It then a lot of this is the staffing of the various government agencies. Who do those officials get to appoint? A lot of this is who are the judges who are going to hear the cases, because this is all going to get litigated, right? And so who's on this? The Supreme Court's in the news this week. There will be huge Supreme Court cases up on this topic over the next several years. So who's on the Supreme Court will matter a lot. And then, quite honestly, it's big question is who's going to be able to get away with what, sort of under cover of darkness. Right? Are people going to care? Are they going to speak up? Is it going to show up in polling? Are people going to, basically show up at town hall meetings with politicians and basically say, do you know about this and are you going to stop this?